I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know the discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello, and welcome back for another episode of I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Booncher. Tonight's episode, mixtape of headlights, Albatross, and initiation. People around my age will know exactly what mixtape means, but for those of you that don't, so back in the day when cassettes and CDs ruled the music world, you could take your favorite songs and record them on a cassette or CD. Sort of an early version of having a digital player like the iPod to customize your music, but with way fewer songs. And you needed your boombox to listen to them, or your Walkman, if we're going to go back that far. Speaking of way back, sometimes you'd actually just hold your cassette recorder up to the radio and hit record when your favorite songs came on. Yes, obviously caveman compared to now, but it was all you could do. And you'd make them for going to the gym or listening to in your room or your car or for that boyfriend or girlfriend that you happen to be seeing. And they're a lot of work. Well, actually, as I'm noting and writing out notes for this episode, I went and asked my 18-year-old daughter and her friend if they knew what a mixtape was, and if they did, explaining with a snicker, so I guess I don't really need to explain it as much. So back to the podcast. As I've mentioned a couple times before, there's a lot of ideas, incidents, and stories, just sometimes they just don't really translate over to being like a full-length episode. So you would have a very slow build-up and bang, the event or the thing that is interesting, and then it drops off. So I've been thinking about doing an episode with more than one story, and kind of reminded me of the mixtape, so kind of full circle. So I'm going to give it a try. So here we go. First story, headlights. I was working as a patrol officer. I was pretty young and new, and as most of us, when you first start out, you're working some version of a night shift or early morning shift. Well, in patrol, whenever there's downtime or time that you're not running call to call, you do what you call OV, which is on view. Well, on view is basically anything proactive. So you're doing vehicle stops, you're stopping people in a dark alley, you're watching that convenience store that's been hit, by the same robber for the last few weeks, things like that. And if you don't, or I should say, if you have reports to write, this would be the time that you would do that as well. But, of course, nobody wants to do that. So sometimes maybe you had some paper to write, but you pushed it off because you wanted to go be proactive and do those things when there was those rare opportunities to do so. Well, I never really liked working traffic, writing tickets or taking wrecks or doing drunks, and just really wasn't my gig. But you could certainly use those vehicle stops to look for something else, like somebody might have an arrest warrant or somebody that might have some dope in the car or things of that nature. So I'm sitting on the side of the road just watching traffic go by, and I'm watching for someone that might have a taillight out or someone who's flying down the road or making a crazy lane change, etc. And I'm kind of tucked in. I got my headlights off, got my dome light off, can't really see anything. I got a good spot. Well, I see a car coming toward me and it doesn't have its headlights on. So I'm like, yeah, perfect. Here we go. So I pull out as soon as there's a break in traffic and hit the overheads and get up behind the guy pretty quick, call in the stop on the radio so they know where I'm at and what I'm doing. And I catch up to him pretty quick and he pulls over, no problem. Well, I walk up to the car and I ask for the usual driver's license, proof of insurance, registration. And, it's pretty obvious he's probably not anything that I'm looking for. He's a super clean-cut guy. Inside of the car seems fine. Just usually you can tell almost right away when you make those stops. Well, as the stop progresses, I ask, hey, do you know why I pulled you over? He says no, and I tell him. He says, oh, okay, sorry, no problem. He reaches in, flicks on his headlights, no problem. Well, then he follows up with, well, you don't have yours on either. So I'm thinking, you're funny. And as I turn, I look and I see that I did not have my headlights on. So all I could say was, yeah, you're right. I don't have my headlights on either, because obviously I had forgotten to turn them on when I jumped out into traffic. I had my overheads on, but I didn't have any headlights on. Well, the guy says, oh, I just thought maybe it was some kind of new way that, the cops were pulling people over and trying to stay stealthy or sneaky or whatever. And kind of had to say, well, no, not so much. I just forgot to turn my headlights on. Well, I ended that stop with saying that, hey, let's both turn our headlights on and drive safe and have a good night. And I always remember that because that was just one of those many incidents that, I had to kind of fight that urge of being kind of the jerk cop that can't admit that he or she was wrong, because obviously I was. And, it goes a long way. It goes a long way when you can just say, yeah, you know what, you're right. I was wrong. Done. Next story, Albatross. I was working in special investigations the first time when I was a detective. And in addition to other things that we did in there are a lot of drug investigations. They're large, small, long, short, different types of drugs, different quantities of drugs, etc. Well, one aspect of the drug investigations that the Bureau had to do were called to-dos, and they're still called to-dos, I'm sure. Well, a to-do is where a citizen calls in a complaint about, a neighbor or sometimes ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, in-law, maybe a competitor who they allege are using and or selling drugs. Now, a to-do can have something to do with something that's criminal other than drugs, but the vast majority of these were drug-related. And, a lot of these, I'd say, our department was pretty good about addressing, and especially the ones that were valid or appeared to be valid. And a lot of the guys didn't necessarily like to work them because they took away from the other things that you wanted to do, or like a bigger case that you were trying to develop or generate. But all in all, the majority of them were worked, and we always did the best we could. Well, one of the ways to address a valid to-do was to develop probable cause for a search warrant and then hit the place and make a couple of arrests. So the complainant would be happy, it was a successful case, and it resolved the complaint, at least in the short time, if not longer. Probable cause could be developed in a few ways. We could use a UC detective or a CI. Another way was by what we call a trash runner pulling the garbage. And this involved taking the garbage from the house, business, apartment, whatever, and then going through it. Well, it sounds as nasty as it is. And especially crooks and not so upstanding citizens tend to have some pretty nasty, disgusting garbage. Well, if things are located in the trash that were indicative of using and or dealing drugs or any other criminal activity, and we can tie that to the people that we're looking at, then we can use that as part of the process to obtain the search warrant. There's a little more to it, but that's the gist. Well, there's a particular to-do location that my squad was working on due to the people that lived there. These guys are a bunch of burglars and thieves and drug users, among other things, and we are really trying to hit the place with a search warrant and get some good arrests and some good charges out of it. Well, after trying a few of the different things, then we decided that we needed to resort to a trash pull. Well, this place presented a problem in that it was a house, and so they shared an alley dumpster with a couple of other houses. Translation, a lot of garbage. And that meant it would take a little more work to isolate it and find what we were looking for to hopefully get that info for the warrant. We worked with sanitation, and we had a truck that would go into the alley on garbage day, and it would only pick up that particular dumpster. And there's a bunch of steps that you have to take to, ensure the chain of custody and make sure the investigation is correct. But eventually that truck will bring that dumpster to a place that we prepare at one of the city yards. And then the fun begins. Well, we have to start to pull out the garbage, bagged, non-bagged, separate, dripping, etc., to do our work. And this particular one happened to be in the middle of the summer. So the combination of nasty food and trash and other things and 110 degree temperature don't mix real well, as you can imagine. So there are three of us that day. It was me, Bob, and Bruce. And we all started working, and of course we're all immediately drenched in sweat and doing our best to not breathe. And when you do something like this, just out of ease, sometimes you'll get what you'd call your stirring stick to pull things out or to move the more particularly nasty things around. Well, Bruce and I are digging in with our sticks or pulling bags, and it isn't long before poor Bob is having some issues. Most of us will gag a little at different points when you do this stuff. It's inevitable, but Bob's really gagging. So much that he has to stop. And of course, whenever this happens, we all laugh at each other and give each other crap. So, that's what happens to poor Bob as he's walking off. Well, Bob walks off making that sound, but in addition to the noises, he's kind of bent over at the waist and he's still walking, stumbling. But every time he would make the sound, he would like throw his arms back like a bird's wings, like trying to take off. So it's basically, the arms would fly back. He'd walk a little bit farther and then it would repeat. And obviously you can tell that I'm laughing even after all these years. Well, poor Bob would get far enough away and kind of the gagging and the flapping would subside. And then he would come right back over and try to, help us do the work. Again, there's a lot of garbage. Well, as soon as the poor guy'd get back over to the can, the gagging would start and he would repeat the process. And then that was kind of where I came up with this term of albatrossing because of the gagging and the flapping arms. I'm like, Bobby, you're looking like an albatross over there flapping and gagging. Well, of course, all this time, Bruce and I are having trouble working ourselves. You know how that is if it's that gag or that somebody basically pukes or throws up, that sometimes can create that chain reaction of nastiness. Well, similar to that. So we're trying to get this work done. It's just disgusting. But at the same time, we're laughing. We're giving Bob a bunch of crap, and we're trying not to join in with the gagging / maybe throwing up ourselves. And I'll give it to Bobby. He soldiered on, he kept coming back, and then he kept getting driven off. We'd all done this numerous times before, but there just was something in that can that really pushed his buttons or whatever. We're not sure what it was. And the funny thing was, it's all funny, but when Bob would get to where he would kind of calm down and he would start walking over to us and start digging through, Bruce would inevitably find some nasty, gross piece of garbage or something, and he'd hook it with that stick. And then he'd kind of slowly move it over toward Bob and say, "Hey, Bobby, what do you think of this?" And then, boom, what do you know? Full albatross mode, off goes Bob for the next couple of minutes. Well, we're glad that you recovered, Bobby. Last story. Initiation. I was a sergeant at this time in special investigations again, and we were working a mobile surveillance on this guy. Well, the guy had previously been stopped by either patrol or my own guys while he was riding his bicycle around with an AK slung over his shoulder, which, hello, nothing draws attention to you like having a nice long gun slung over your shoulder riding a bicycle around. And at that time, there was no crime because, again, we're Arizona, wild, wild west, so the guy didn't go to jail or anything. Well, a week or so later, there's a call that kicks out on the main channel of a man that was cranking off some rounds from an AK in that same general vicinity as we remembered that this guy lived. And I think the physical description matched him as well. Well, we went to the area and we find this guy. He's outside, didn't have the gun with him necessarily that we could see, but we just thought, hey, this is something that could turn into something, so let's follow this guy and set up surveillance on him. Again, nothing to arrest him on, but we want to see if he's going to do anything, lead us to where something's at, or, if he's stupid enough to grab this gun and crank off some rounds again. Well, we land the guy at a place. It's at the corner of a major intersection there in the city, and I think we kind of figured out that he was going in there to grab something to eat, so it should give us a couple minutes to take a break. Well, I take a takeaway position for one direction in my UC car and settle in. This was kind of the time that you would grab something to eat or you'd get a drink, or if you needed to go to the bathroom, depending on the situation, you either had to use the container of your choice in your car or you found something nearby that was available and if you thought you had the time. And of course, this was also the time when your phones had come out. So texting's obviously preferred because it doesn't interfere with any radio traffic. Nobody's on the phone specifically. And most of these guys all of these guys were younger than I was. So they're just texting machines. And then, of course, any work talk would be over the radio. And since we had our own radio channel, that would sometimes get a little bit loose depending on the incident or the setting. But, we were able to have that kind of conversation on the radio, more so than one of the main channels where it was nothing but a bunch of radio codes and much more professional. Anyway, so I stopped and, kind of thinking about things, and I kind of realized that I hadn't really seen my wife in a few days, which is fairly normal for this bureau, other than, a few words in passing or sleeping next to each other. That was about it. So I thought I'd text her, say hello. Well, in the midst of this, a couple of my guys were texting me about this and that, and, the case, the guy, whatever else was going on. So, I'm kind of carrying on these conversations as you can with texting between everybody. Well, one of these guys was a guy named Toma. And Toma was newer to my group. He had been there for maybe 6 months or less. And, like the others, he's a good hard worker and he's a good solid cop. And he fit in really well. And when he first came over, it didn't take him very long before he was up there pulling pranks with the rest of them. And most of the time, as with all the guys on my squads over the years, it seemed to be at my expense. Well, I'm a tangent for a second because whenever I think of Toma, one of his and kind of their funniest pranks that always makes me smile is after we had a squad meeting. And during this meeting, we're discussing some issues, and eventually I got to remind him, hey, listen, squad's not a democracy. This is a dictatorship. And me, of course, being the dictator implied, it was something that we were talking about. I don't recall what it was, some direction in an investigation or how we were going to deal with some issue. Well, it wasn't necessarily common, but sometimes it has to happen. You got to make the decision, move forward. Well, they gave me a little bit of grief, and as always, good squad they are, we moved on and everything was fine. About 3-4 weeks later, I was on vacation for a week. Well, when I come back, I return and I find that my office has been decorated with various dictator memorabilia. The biggest thing was a huge communist flag that they had tacked up on the wall in my office. And I think the funniest part of all that was they had taken some family photos that were framed, they'd copied them, and then they had replaced them in the frames with the faces of guys like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, like looking out or peeking out from in between my wife and my kids. And I still have a couple of those, and every time I run across them doing something, I get a chuckle. Anyway, so back to this surveillance. So I'm texting my wife, I'm texting the guys, things going back and forth, all's good, we're getting a little bit of a break. And at one point, I send my wife a text that says, I need sex tonight. Now, I don't think that that's abnormal, and it is what it is. So, I'm just trying to show my love. It's all good. And, hopefully maybe I'm bettering my chances for late that night when I come home, right? So I sit back and waiting for my wife to respond, hopefully in the positive, and my mind wanders to all the other things, and so be it. Well, except the problem was the text never made it to my wife. It went to Toma. Well, apparently in the midst of all those texts that were bouncing back and forth, I had obviously replied to his text chain instead of my wife's text chain. So Toma's sitting in his car, and he's texting everybody and me, and who knows who else, when he gets the text that says, I need sex tonight. Well, that'll get your attention. So he kind of takes a pause and he confirms that the text is from me. So now it's even worse. So his wheels are really turning. Well, Toma didn't really know me very well still at that point, and he described it as you're still really intimidating to me back then until I learned that you're just a big teddy bear, which is probably accurate. But, consider the mindset. So there's definitely some confusion here. So poor Toma's thinking, is this an initiation? Is this a test? I mean, I'd heard these guys over here are a little nutty, but wow. So he immediately shoots a text to another guy in the squad and copies mine to show him like, hey, boss just sent me this. What the hell? Well, this is, of course, followed by speculation as to what the true meaning is. Some things are fairly mundane. Some of them are a little on the vulgar side, but in general, laughs by everybody involved. Well, he finally gets the nerve to text me back, and he says, is this for me? Well, so, of course, I read this. I happen to be taking a drink of water, and I darn near spit that out all over the windshield, and I'm thinking, oh, my hell, this is pretty funny. So I call him on the phone, and I assure him that it's not an initiation. I really don't want to have sex with them, and no matter what those other knuckleheads tell you, there's nothing else to it. So I call my wife and tell her the story, and she got a good laugh out of it as well. And we all learned a valuable lesson that day about being careful when texting. So with that, I close this mixtape episode of I Barely Got Here. Thank you for listening. And if you like the show, please subscribe, post a review, ask your friends and family to give it a listen. If you have a question or a comment, shoot me an email at ibarelygodhere@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Sam42 is 107.